he wanted to be a general. He was famously Rome's wealthiest man. It's like richus crassus is one of these old expressions that no one uses anymore, but they did at one point. And
I was going to say, I haven't heard that
yeah,
one.
no.
Maybe
yeah.
they say that out in Chicago, but not here.
Yeah, no. And the libraries at Cambridge, pretty much, nowhere else. Anyway, so a huge range of ranged weapons, basically, alongside the core, which is the heavy infantry of the legions. And they're all about close combat fighting. After they throw those first two, how it tends to work, at least in the imperial era, so they have their 2 javelins. They get within 100 yards, throw those 2 javelins, and try and disable some shields and some men, ideally, on the enemy side. Then draw their swords, and the rest of it is all close quarter fighting. And they rely on their superior discipline and cohesion as a unit to win out against the enemies. So really the Romans rely on their heavy infantry to hold the enemy's center, whoever they're engaging, while their other lighter units are usually allies, and they're called auxiliaries in the imperial era when it becomes professionalized, who are often either lighter infantry, cavalry, whatever else, more mobile units to come around, get behind the enemy, and really disrupt their formation.
Right. So, like at the Battle of Zama, how many days does something like this go on?
I think it's over the course of 2 days. Again,
not crazy long.
No. Usually it's a one-day thing. Usually engagements are pretty quick, only a few hours. So you think of how heavy the armor is and how heavy the weapons are. You can't keep that going all day. It happens sometimes, but it's not very effective.
And like, if they have a multi-day battle, though, is it like? We see some of these funny stories sometimes, like in World War I, you can see pictures of the Germans and the French playing and British playing soccer together because there were wolves. So they said, all right, we're not going to fight today. They play soccer or whatever, and then the next day they go back to killing each other. Is it kind of similar then, too? Like if people have been battling for 6 hours and there's a lot of death and people are tired and shit, they go, all right, we're going to go over here. You guys are going to go over there. Everyone chill?
Well, there are truces to recover the dead. Above all, so like after it's going on for a day, especially if it's going to be a multi-day engagement, they'll have a truce to recover their fallen from the battlefield, and they'll both be in the field at the same time, just picking up the wounded above all.
So bizarre.
And during civil wars, when everyone's speaking Latin, there is definitely fraternization, between units, people who knew each other, but those are often the hardest fought wars because they're fighting the same way, and so it's totally symmetrical warfare, and it gets pretty bloody.
Isn't it crazy how this is a human history thing, how wars are fought between a bunch of dudes who are sent there by a few dudes in an office who just disagree with each other?
Yeah, that's modern history in a nutshell, honestly.
It's 100% it. It's like you're not really, at the end of the day, like most of these guys, they're just following orders. Like, okay, well, I'm part of this country or this thing, so I guess I got to fight this battle. But, they see, hey, Steve, what are you doing here? And Steve's like ready to kill them the next day.
Right.
It's kind of sick.
Well, it is. And in the Civil Wars, there are all kinds of anecdotes about people, brothers killing brothers, friends killing friends. And you're not only fighting for a principle. You're fighting for just this general or that general. They're both Roman. They both stand for the same thing. So it's kind of hard to be too fired up about that. You just hope that your guy pays you better in the end.
They stood, in a lot of these, they stood for like the same thing. They just wanted power. That was it?
Pretty much.
Because like you could argue the Civil War, obviously you would argue the Civil War in the United States.
Our Civil War,
totally
yes.
different.
There are very important principles at stake. But in the Roman Civil Wars, in the era of Caesar, it's just who's on top. That's it. Whether it's Caesar or Pompey or Augustus or Anthony. So really, there might be long-term differences in how things might have turned out if General A or General B becomes emperor. But for the guy who's fighting, it's the same general package.
How did the Roman public feel about the initial first triumvirate coming in, which is really where it starts to turn from republic to empire? Not officially, but like, we're down that path. How was that? Obviously, you said Caesar was well respected across the burgeoning empire, but how did they sell that as like, hey, this is kind of the same thing, don't worry about it?
Well, the important thing is they didn't sell it. It was an unofficial agreement. So they kind of, made this arrangement, and everyone kind of knew about it, but it wasn't like, it was ratified by the people. It just was a working agreement between 3 very ambitious men. And all of them benefited from this agreement, and so they held to it as long as they did benefit from it.
Who were the other 2 again?
Pompey and Crassus.
And
Crassus gets killed in Parthia when he tries to go off and conquer that Eastern Empire. And of course,
he was a general.
he wanted to be a general. He was famously Rome's wealthiest man. It's like richus crassus is one of these old expressions that no one uses anymore, but they did at one point. And
I was gonna say, I haven't heard that.
yeah,
one.
no,
Maybe
yeah.
they say that out in Chicago, but not here.
Yeah, no. And the libraries at Cambridge, pretty much, nowhere else.
Yeah.
Anyway, he was famous as a real estate speculator who would do literal fire sales. He would buy houses as they were burning down. And he had his own squad of firefighting slaves who would then put out the fires, fix it up, and make a good bargain on the price. Of course, the owner is watching his house burn down. So unscrupulous, let's say, is a good word for Crassus.
I'll give you $5. Okay,
Yeah,
deal.
yeah, all right.
Put it out. We're
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
It's worth 20.
All right, boys, at it. And then they come running in. He also famously defeated Spartacus, and that was 13 years before all this had started. But he was never really a general. He was a businessman who wanted glory that comes from winning battles.
So he wore the armor. He tried to go out there and be that, but you're saying he wasn't that guy.
Yeah, he spent most of his time being a businessman. Where Caesar, is a politician at heart, but is a very gifted general. And so is Pompey.
Right.
Crassus is not really a general. He's just, someone who knows what you have to do in the Roman system to get credit.
So because Crassus is a part of the triumvirate, him becoming a general, he had, I'm guessing here, you tell me if I'm right or wrong, he had the power to say, okay, I'll take these 4 legions, you're coming with me, because he's one of the 3. And then they're like, oh, well, I guess that's our general.
It was sanctioned by the state. He was given an official position to do this, to go off to Parthia. But it was because Caesar and Pompey agreed, and their allies allowed him to get all these resources that he needed for this sort of grand conquest.
Right.
So just a lot of dealing and wheeling to make it all happen.
Now, you mentioned with his slaves, obviously there's like a lot of human history in different places. There's a history of slavery within ancient Rome. And we'll get to gladiators and stuff like that later. But how was it determined that people would become slaves? Because it's like they conquer all these areas and these places become a part of the empire. So obviously a lot of people who live there aren't slaves, but then they get slaves. So who became a slave and why?
There are many ways. So during the conquest of that empire, a lot of people are enslaved. A lot of Greeks are enslaved. A lot of Syrians are enslaved. And their descendants, most of them, remain slaves for centuries. People can be freed much more readily in the Roman system than they could, say, in the American South later on, because Roman slavery is not racial, among other things.
Right. It seems hard to keep track of.
Well, and it was. There's a famous debate in the Senate where they wanted to know, they want slaves to wear an identifying badge or something, so they know who's a slave. And they're like, wait a minute, they'll know how many of them there are. They'll know their own. They'll know their own numbers, which are probably in the hundreds of thousands around Rome.
Yeah.
A single Roman family could have 300 slaves, a wealthy household, and a big estate could have thousands. And that's at the high end, of course. Most Romans don't have so many, but it is possible. Anyway, so people become slaves because they're enslaved initially when the empire's expanding, and their descendants are slaves unless they're freed. You inherit the status of your mother legally. Your mom's a slave, you're a slave. There's other ways. They raid outside the empire around like the Black Sea, for example, what's now the Ukraine. That gets heavily raided for slaves. They go east into Parthia. They go south into Nubia, all over the place. And there's internal slavery too. People who kidnap travelers and enslave them. It's kind of one of these horror stories that happens to travelers. Is you always you're afraid of being kidnapped while you're off on a lonely road, and chained in a workhouse where slaves spend their whole lives in the dark, making stuff for some rich guy. That happens. So there's a lot of...
It could happen to like anyone. I mean, that's the scary part in Gladiator. Like that's kind of an example. Like he's asleep on his estate. Some guys come up and boom, he's a slave.
Yeah. And they're called ergastula, these slave workhouses, and that happens. But for the most part, it seems to be biological increase. Just there are a lot of slaves at the start of the imperial era, and they have a lot of kids who are slaves by default. The usual estimate, and it's just an estimate, is that about 10% of the empire's population was slave.
That almost seems low.
And it might be. There are definitely times, like during the conquest of the rest of the Mediterranean world, where Rome and Italy are overflowing with slaves, where the price is incredibly low for a slave. But during the imperial era, when there's fewer wars of conquest, it seems like 10% is roughly about what we're probably dealing with.
Right.
And that's still probably 7 or 8 million people. That's a lot of people.
What was outside? I mean, there's different types and stuff. Like you just mentioned the ones working in a dark room chained to a desk.
Right.
That's different. But what was the life of a typical Roman slave like in Rome? Like some of them,
Yeah.
did they get to behave as if they were free, but they're technically owned by someone? How did it work?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, there is no typical Roman slave, right? There's a huge range of outcomes. In the countryside, it's generally harsher. They're harvesting the fields, they're cutting down weeds, they're taking grapes and olives off their vines and trees. And it's rare for you to get freed if you're working on a country estate. But in the city, where you're in much closer touch with your masters, where you're working in a household, then there's a much greater chance you'll be freed and have a lot of scope for agency. So often, owners actually train their slaves, educate them to a highly lucrative career. They'll make them, I don't know, my slave is a good leather worker. My slave can dress meat for banquets. And they'll rent them out, basically. In some cases, to incentivize the slave, they'll get to keep a portion of their earnings and use that money eventually to buy their own freedom. And so a lot of slaves, their trajectory is that they're bought by the master, trained in some skill, then perform that skill on their master's behalf on kind of a semi-independent basis, buy their own freedom, and then remain as a freedman, sort of an associate of their former master.
Right.
But their kids then are free and with no scruples. They can become consul if they want. And there are a couple emperors who are sons of slaves.
Really?
Which is pretty remarkable. Even Diocletian, the famous reformer, was probably the son of a slave.
That's wild. So there's upward mobility seriously in Roman society.
And actually, interestingly, slaves in the city of Rome have more mobility than most provincials who are free do. Because there's just chances. You have access to power and to powerful people if you're a slave of that powerful person that the average provincial guy on his farm doesn't have.
Wow. So I guess the confusing part to me, though, is if they don't base it on race, so it's not physically attributable, and you don't have pictures back then, you don't have massive social communication, I never understand how it's not so easy for literally every slave to run away.
Well, it does happen.
It definitely happens, but why doesn't it happen with all of them?
I think the most obvious answer might be that for many slaves in these positions where they have enough freedom to get away, they have more incentive to stay and play it by the book and get freedom from their master than to go live on the lam and be, off the grid. Because if they play by the rules and get freed in due course, they'll have their master's patronage, they'll have resources, they'll have wealth. But if they run away, they'll be a landless refugee. And so for people who have enough power and agency to get away easily, they probably see into the future and say, okay, if I wait a few more years, I don't like this very much, but I'll have a much better life, or a much better shot at a better life if I wait it out. But if you're out in the fields, your life's going to be terrible anyway.
Right.
There, the problem is that where do you go? I mean, there's just more and more estates. You can get into the mountains maybe, but if you're in the middle of Sicily, for example, there are a few great slave rebellions. When there are the most slaves in the late Republic, when they've conquered all these territories and there are tens of thousands pouring into Italy every year, that's when the three big slave wars happen. And the last of those is the war with Spartacus. The first two were on Sicily, and they involved probably upwards of 100,000 slaves in each case who, got free, killed their masters, and rampaged around. But the Romans sent the legions, and of course the legions butchered all of them, and that was the end of that. Spartacus, famously, was a gladiator, but who escaped from a school near Capua, not too far from Naples, and eventually had well over 100,000 slaves following him all over the south of Italy. He tried to escape, supposedly, make a deal with the pirates to get out of Italy, but, that's might be hearsay. He never did get out of Italy, and was eventually hunted down by Crassus in cooperation with Pompey. So the thing is that revolt on any scale, large or small, isn't probably going to work. And it's hard to get away. There are slave catchers, there's branding, there's chains. And so it's difficult. Branding. There is branding and tattooing. Actually, tattooing is, first found on a large scale in this period in Europe. And it's almost entirely for slaves. You tattoo a slave who's tried to escape.
How realistic was it in Gladiator when he had the mark of the Roman legion on his shoulder? Was that something they did as well?
They did that later on. So like in the later Roman period, when soldiers often tried to go AWOL and escape from the legions because it was a pretty bad lot,
Right.
they began to tattoo soldiers with the names of their units. And so they're probably 100 years ahead of themselves there in Gladiator.
Got it. Okay. Real quick, I just got to go to the bathroom, but we'll be right back. Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here